So glad you made it out. Good morning, everyone. My name is Drew. I'm one of the pastors here. We've actually been in a series in the book of Colossians. And the book of Colossians, if you know anything about the scriptures, it was written by several different authors, the Bible was, because it's actually a collection of books. And the book of Colossians is actually a letter that was written from a fellow by the name of Paul, who was writing to this early church in the city of Asia Minor called Colossae. And so that's why the book is called Colossians. And it's this letter that Paul is writing. And again, Paul is someone who, he himself was this staunch Jewish Pharisee, so he was this religious professional who has this radical encounter with Jesus, ends up redirecting his entire life and becomes someone who becomes one of the biggest proponents of the news of Jesus and this movement that would begin, that would be called Christianity, that would end up touching the globe. And we sit in this very room because of folks like Paul, who took this message and began to proclaim it throughout societies and countries and cities. And so Paul is actually writing this letter from prison. He was thrown in prison, of course, because he was someone who was propagating the news of Jesus in the Roman Empire. He was thrown in prison, and he's writing this letter to the church in Colossae, trying to encourage them, let them know that, hey, what you are doing, I want to affirm you, especially when you feel like everything is against you. And so Epaphras, who's the one who brought Paul news about this new church that started in Colossae, Paul's writing this letter. And one of the things that we've been talking about as we've been exploring the past few weeks is in the beginning, he's talking about how really he's encouraging this church in Colossae about what it means to understand God, to know him, not to just simply know about him. And we use this word, this Greek word called gnosko, which is the word that Paul uses. And he says, not just gnosko, not just knowing about God and his gospel and the good news of what Christian faith is all about, but instead epignosko, to really, truly, deeply know what it means to know the goodness and the grace of God. Now, one of the things that we're going to talk about today, and again, over the past few weeks, we've been talking about what does it mean for us to fully know him. And last week, Kathy preached this message on the bigness of who God is, that in him and by him and for him, Jesus created all things, and he's reconciled all things back into himself. And then we get to this passage that we come to today, where, again, Paul is still in his introduction, and notice what he writes to the early church. And what he's writing to the church in Colossae, notice immediately after he talks about the bigness of God and how he's reconciled them to himself, reconciled the world and everything in it to himself. Look what Paul writes. He writes this: once you were alienated. Can I hear you say alienated? That's right. Once you were alienated from God and were enemies. Can I hear you say enemies? In your minds because of your evil. Can I hear you say evil? Behavior. So there you go. So now here Paul is, he's writing. Now here's the thing, whether you're a Christian or you're not, you probably came in today and you're like, I knew it. I knew this is what Christians talk about all the time, how we're evil, how we're sinful, and there's judgmental language everywhere. And see, it's right there, underlined. There's alienated, there's enemies, there's this idea that you're evil behavior. Now, I know for woke New Yorkers, which I know many of you are, like this kind of language immediately speaks against, like, you know, our own sensibilities and our own sense of kindness. And here's what I want to kind of just deposit to you guys just from the very get-go is that first of all, this letter is written to other Christians, okay? This is not some sort of license for Christians to go to non-Christians and be like, you're enemies! God is out to get you, are evil! No. This is actually a letter that's being written from Paul to a group of early Christians, and he's trying to tell them the reality of our condition before God that we lived in and with which we believe as Christians. So to kind of get started then, if you're someone who's not a Christian and immediately, like there's this visceral reaction towards this language, I want you to know this language is not meant for you. And it's not meant for Christians to take this as a sword to people who don't believe in God. No, instead it's a description of what Christians believe about the human condition. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is really the human condition that I think is fundamental to, I believe, and I think it explains in a very realistic way what all of us experience as human beings, whether you're religious or you're not. And it's one of the truths that we are to embrace if we're fully to say that we want to follow this Jesus fellow. Because this kind of doctrine or this belief of what Paul's talking about, this idea that we were alienated, that we're enemies, and there's evil behavior is actually somewhat core to what Christians need to believe about our relationship to God. Now, here's the thing. When Paul is writing this, he's writing this idea of you were all enemies. You were all alienated. You were all people who practiced evil behavior. There's actually this theme that runs through kind of the course of Paul's writing to different churches. In fact, in Romans chapter 3, verse 23, which is another church in Rome, look at what he writes about our condition. He says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." High five your neighbor and say, "All have sinned." That's right. In fact, high five your other neighbor and say, "Did you know you're a sinner?" Can you do that real quick? All right, yeah, that was kind of awkward, right? Gosh, these are fighting words. And yet, here's what Paul is writing. Now, here's where it's different, and what I would argue is actually, in many ways, I think each of us, and maybe you're not a Christian here, you can kind of hear these words, and again, there's this visceral reaction against, and maybe even a defensiveness that exists with this. What are you talking about? I'm a sinner. And yet, Paul repeatedly talks about this idea. You are a sinner. All of us are sinners. Now, there was this ancient way of believing about who God was in favor of and who God was not in favor of. And kind of in the ancient world, the beliefs about God and who were sinners, who was favored by God and who was unfavored by God, it kind of went like this. And again, you can look throughout kind of history and ancient civilizations. The belief was basically this. If one was wealthy, if one was powerful, if one was good looking, if one was a great athlete, whatever it might be, if those things, if all of those things in one's life was great, then you were known to likely be blessed by God or the gods. But if you were someone who was marginalized, if you were poor, if you grew up in a condition or an illness of some sort, if you were basically on the bottom rung of society, then you were probably someone who was cursed by God or someone who was unfavored by God. Now, here's the thing. Even though that's an ancient belief that throughout kind of history, whether it's religious systems or whether it's just general worldviews, in many ways, that same kind of perspective on God, his favor, who is right, who is good, the sense of superiority versus inferiority. Let's be honest. In today's world, that very much still exists. This idea that some people are better than others. This idea that somehow we are, more woke than others, or this idea somehow that those people think they're woke, but they're not nearly as woke as I'm woke. I'm so woke that I'm woke about my wokeness, right? There's ways in which we constantly find ways to feel superior to others, or maybe some ways that we feel diminished or inferior to others. Now, here's one way that Christian theology actually kind of debunks all of that. And the way that Paul does it, he says this: guess what? You're all sinners. You're all messed up. So, high five your neighbor and say, "Did you know you're a sinner?" Can you do that real quick? That's right. Now, high five your other neighbor and say, "I'm a sinner too." Can you do that real quick? Now, do you see then, so Christian theology, this is what it does. It says no matter your pedigree, no matter your background, no matter how wealthy you are, no matter all these ways in which the world might try to define us and separate us, Christian theology says, no, do you understand? Every single one of us are sinners. All of us were alienated. All of us were enemies. All of us, every single one of us, we practice evil behavior. Now, the problem begins, though, when some of us don't think we are quite as sinful as others. And in many ways, what's so fascinating is what gets hijacked is that Christians end up being the people who end up dividing and being morally superior. But here's what I'm going to posit to you. Here's what Paul says about what the early church was supposed to be known about. It's that we're all sinners. Now, this manifests itself in several different ways. So, for instance, in interpersonal relationships, this manifests itself. Whenever I teeter from, instead of embracing the fact that I'm a broken, wounded sinner, and I start kind of advancing into this stage of superiority or feeling like I'm better than, things usually don't end up working very well. So, for example, like with my wife, Tina, who's not in the service right now, thankfully, right? There are these moments when we get into conflict, and here's where conflicts usually arise between us. There's this moment where she and I are having an argument about something, and of course, she's wrong. And so when she's wrong, I want her to know that she's wrong. And in fact, I'm so incredulous that she would be so wrong, and I will actually say things like this. I'll say, I can't, I can't believe how wrong you are right now. Like, you are so wrong that, like, if there was anyone else in this room right now, and I'll use this argument with her, sadly. I'll be like, if there was anyone else in this room right now, they would be pointing out how wrong you are right now, too. And then I'll actually say something like this. I'll say, do you realize how lucky you are to be married to me? Like, do you realize, like, I'm a good husband. Like, I'm good. I'm a good husband. And she'll just look at me and she'll be like, did you really just say that to me right now? I mean, because there's this moment, right? But here's the thing, right? Like, here's what I've fallen into, I realize, when I get into these conflicts. There's this word called delusional. And that's usually what I've fallen into those moments, especially when I use words like that. And now, isn't that interesting? In marriage relationships or in any kind of relationship, do you see that? Whenever one party begins to feel superior or think that they are super entitled or better than, it ends up crushing the relationship because all of a sudden, I become someone who's so self-righteous. Now, that happens in marriages, but that happens in culture too. Whenever it's impossible to love someone or to forgive someone when I feel superior to them. Miroslav Volf, who's a Croatian writer and theologian, one of the things he writes in his book, Exclusion and Embrace, he says, forgiveness is impossible when I exclude my enemy from the community of humans and I exclude myself from the community of sinners. Isn't that true? When it's impossible, because all of a sudden I start feeling superior to others, or I start diminishing others and see them as inferior. And we do this all the time. Now, here's how Christian theology gets at the heart of this and crushes all of that. It basically says, you are all sinners. You are all sinners, every single one of you. It doesn't matter your pedigree. It doesn't matter how great you are. You were once all aliens, all alienated from God, all evil in your behavior. You were all once enemies of God. Now, this whole idea then of Christian theology basically saying everyone's, do you see how leveling this is? Now, what's fascinating about it is that Jesus, there were two groups of people that he constantly, repeatedly would be rebuking and challenging. Now, here's the thing. I know that Christians have this reputation in today's society as being very demeaning towards others and being judgmental. But here's what's fascinating is Jesus, the founder of Christianity, the one who Christians claim to worship and say, Jesus is our model. He's the one that we follow. Jesus often had two groups of people that he was constantly, repeatedly rebuking and saying, hey, you've missed the mark. You know who those groups were? Number one was a group, it was usually the wealthy. And he would be decrying the wealthy, not necessarily because it was a sin to be wealthy, because in fact, some of the earliest followers of Jesus were people from incredibly wealthy backgrounds. So for instance, Joseph of Arimathea, he's an example that's used. He's someone who's known as being wealthy. Even Joseph from the Old Testament, he's an example who advances in his career and becomes a person of incredible wealth and influence, and he's someone who's elevated. Now, what's interesting is, why does Jesus talk to the wealthy in such kind of striking terms? Well, one reason why is because oftentimes it's not wealth itself, but it's what wealth gives me. Wealth gives me this sense of superiority. Wealth gives me this sense of control. Wealth gives me this sense of, listen, I don't need anyone. I've got money. I've got all of this stuff that lends me to be able to do things on my own and to be self-sufficient. And so Jesus decries that, especially when the wealthy continue to use their wealth and leverage it in ways that do not benefit those who are less fortunate, the marginalized, the poor. So this whole idea then that we're all sinners, this does not mean that we kind of we shy away from speaking out against injustice and inequity. No, this is why the heart of Jesus has always been for those on the margins and those who are oppressed. But nonetheless, Jesus doesn't only speak to the wealthy in such a manner. He also speaks to a second group of people. And you know who this group of people are? It's the religious professionals. It's the Pharisees. It's the people who continue to teach about the Bible but live far from it. Jesus' harshest critiques are not towards sinners. In fact, the moniker that was given to Jesus was, he's a friend of sinners. Now, isn't that interesting? Can you imagine if Christians were known as friends of sinners? Can you imagine if that was the reputation? Yeah, that was the reputation of Jesus, friend of sinners. And Jesus' harshest remarks were actually towards the religious elite, towards the religious professionals, towards the people who spoke on platforms and talked on behalf of God. Now, I'm somewhat sheepish about that because here I am, a religious professional, and yet Jesus, that's who Jesus was most warning of. That's who he was most cautious about. Now, why is that? It's because somehow it's also religion that can lead to superiority. It's somehow professional religiosity that can lead us to believe that we're better than others. And honestly, in today's political climate, isn't that what the religious majority is known for? For thinking they're better than everyone? For thinking somehow that they have kind of this block of truth and they are the guardians of God. Now, what's fascinating is that Jesus had a much different reputation. And in fact, his harshest criticisms were towards the religious. Why? It's because whether it's wealth or whether it's religion, or whatever it is that somehow convinces or tries to convince me and you and all of us that we're okay, whatever it might be, whether it's wealth, whether it's religion, it's all of those things, what they do is they keep us away from this belief that somehow we're all sinners. And what Paul is basically writing to the church in Colossae is, guess what? You were all alienated. You were all enemies. You were all evil in your behavior. And what Christianity does, it just kind of levels the field and it says, yes, every single one of us are sinners. And anytime there's a semblance of pride that starts to swell in me, that starts to say, no, I'm actually better than those people. I'm actually better than those Republicans. I'm actually better than those Democrats. I'm actually better. Whenever that starts to swell in me, I've kind of missed this essential teaching. Now, I've talked before about my fondness for the 12-step movement and for in going to these recovery groups, whether it's Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Sexual Recovery Anonymous. And one of the most meaningful moments in any meeting for me whenever I attend is when, there's people from all sorts of backgrounds, all sorts of different classes that walk into this meeting, whether they're people who are dressed in expensive suits and working on Wall Street, they come into the meeting. There's people who are homeless and kind of walking in off the street that are basically in this meeting. And there's people who are, students who are just walking in off the street and kind of sitting around. And what's fascinating is that here are a group of New Yorkers sitting around, and each one gives an introduction, and the introduction goes a little bit like this. Hi, my name is Drew, and I'm an alcoholic. And then the next person, hi, my name is Frank, and I'm an alcoholic. Hi, my name is John, I'm an alcoholic. My name is Elizabeth, I'm an alcoholic. And what happens then is that every single one of us then, we end up just sharing this reality. And of course, I say, hey, my name is Drew, I'm an alcoholic, and everyone says, hi, Drew. And it's not, hi, my name is Drew, and this is where I went to university, this is my GPA, this is how much money I have, these are the properties that I own or don't own, this is where I live in this. No. There's actually this leveling thing where we've all come into this gathering and we've all confessed and admitted my own fallenness, my own brokenness, my own evil behavior, my own proclivity towards making unwise choices, the fact that I am a sinner. The fact that I mess up, the fact that I am prone to follow my addiction, the fact that I'm prone to follow my addictions. And in many ways, of course, Alcoholics Anonymous was founded on these Christian principles. That's really the essence of what Paul is saying. Once you were all enemies, you were all alienated. You all did evil behavior that separated us from God. Now, here's the thing. Some of you are like, man, Drew, this is a really kind of discouraging message. But in many ways, it's also somewhat encouraging because here's what the Christian message basically says. It says that every single one of us are sinners. All of us. It doesn't exclude one group from the other. Every single one of us. Tim Keller, who's a pastor in the city, one of the things that he writes is this. He says, with the gospel, the good news of the Christian faith, all you need is nothing. But most of us do not have Nothing. Most of us don't have it. Most of us don't have nothing. In fact, I would argue that many of you, perhaps in this room, you all and me, we probably have a lot of something. We've got our intellect, we've got our pride, we've got our earning potential, we've got, our LinkedIn profile. We've got all of these different things that somehow give us this sense that I am better than, that I'm greater than, that I am okay, and at least I'm not as bad as so-and-so, or at least I'm I might not be as good as that person, but I'm pretty darn close to that person in terms of how great I am or how wonderful I am. And you know what, Tina, honestly, when it comes to if you were to do power rankings of husbands, I think I'm pretty up there, right? That's kind of, whenever I walk into that kind of mindset, what I've done is basically said, I've got a whole lot of something to show how wonderful I am, to show how self-justified I am. Now, here's what Keller's saying is, don't you see with the gospel, though, with the Christian message, all you need is nothing. But most of us don't have nothing. We've got all sorts of giftedness and all sorts of okayness that we bring to the table. And the Christian message is, no, all you and I need is nothing. Now, what's so phenomenal about what Paul writes about, because he starts with these very harsh words, and again, maybe you heard them as harsh, of alienated, enemies, evil behavior. But look at what Paul says. He writes, once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. Again, every single one of us. He says, but now, high five your neighbor and say, but now. But now, he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. Don't you see the beauty of this? It says, all of you were alienated. All of you were enemies. All of you. Oh, but now because of Jesus and the gift of his grace, his sacrifice, his death on a cross, he has actually brought us into a relationship. We were once alienated. We were once enemies. But now we are friends. Through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. If you continue in your faith, established and firm. Do not move from the hope held out in the gospel. And this is what he's basically saying. So many of us, we move when it comes to the things, to the nothing we have to offer. We end up trusting. The reason why Jesus was decrying religious people is because it's so easy for religious people to trust their goodness, their morality, their sense of rightness. The reason why Jesus decries the wealthy when they do it at the kind of the expense of the poor is because it's so easy for the wealthy to trust in my own kind of strength, my own stature, my own wealth, my own control. And Jesus says, no. And what Paul is writing is, when you hold firm to the gospel, when you hold firm to this reality, don't you see? When you go from gnosko, right, from just simply knowing about the gospel, to epignosko, to really knowing it, what it's done is it's melted your heart in such a way. It's so influential over your life and your view of yourself. Because, first of all, it reveals to you that you were once enemies. You were alienated. You were a sinner. But don't you see, you can also begin to embrace the goodness of God. The goodness of God that comes through Christ. And when you can hold firm in that gospel, this is the gospel that you heard and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and in which I, Paul, have become a servant. See, the Christian gospel is a but now kind of gospel. It means that, yes, all of us are sinners. All of us are alienated. All of us make mistakes. All of us make regrettable choices. But now, there's a God in heaven who, despite your background, despite whatever struggles you have, will not leave you or forsake you, who is with you, who is for you, who loves you, who embraces you. And if you can stand firm in that good news, he is a but now kind of God. And that whatever dislocation you and I might feel at different moments, dislocation because of the status of our career, dislocation because of the status of our relationships, Like, this is what Paul is basically saying. When you stand firm in the gospel, when you've truly epigenoskoed the gospel, you realize he's got you. His love is for you. His gift is free. And as many times as we might say, well, I don't know if I deserve it. I don't know. I'm not even a Christian yet. I haven't made that, that kind of decision. Or I've been making really poor decisions. Or this is what my friends think of me and it makes me feel awful. Like Paul is basically saying, no, you've missed the gospel. The gospel is, if you can just come with nothing, if you can just come humbly with nothing, then his love is free and full and lavish for you. It's for you. And this is the good news. When we move from simply knowing about it to epigenosko, to truly knowing this good news, it changes everything. One way that I've put it before and then I'll put it again is this: the Christian gospel is the most exclusively inclusive message there is. The Christian gospel is exclusively inclusive. Now, how can I make that kind of argument? I can make that argument because you see how it's exclusively inclusive, because the reason why it's inclusive is because what do you need to become a Christian? Do you need to get your life fixed up? Do you need to have graduated from this university or gone to this kind of grad school? No. All you need is nothing. All you need is to admit that you have nothing and that you need God. Now, I realize that in some ways, it hits against us because we're like, wait a minute, but I'm actually quite brilliant, and I actually have pretty good earning potential, and, well, see, then you've kind of missed the gospel. You've missed the heart of it. See, but do you see how it's exclusively inclusive? It's inclusive because people from various different backgrounds, socioeconomic classes, anyone is welcome if you admit you've got nothing and you need God. I remember when I first moved to New York, I was part of this church in Queens that was this remarkably diverse church, people from many different nations. And here I was rubbing shoulders with people, and I had just come from a university out in California, and I'd moved here. Now here I am, like rubbing shoulder to shoulder with people that were far older than me, and families, and people from various different nations and backgrounds. And on one of the services, I was invited to share my story, my testimony. And I shared my story about how I became a Christian and how I grew up in this immigrant context in Los Angeles. I grew up actually attending church regularly as a kid. Those churches ended up splitting for very harsh reasons, and I shared the story of like the pain of that, of going to a church, but then these churches, splitting in really acrimonious and harsh fights, and somehow, because of the good news of Jesus, I trusted him, and somehow God has continued to be real to me in the midst of whatever turmoil I went through at home, and et cetera, et cetera. So I shared this story, and then the person after me who was sharing her story was this woman who grew up abandoned by her parents and rampant drug use in the neighborhood. And she ended up kind of growing up, and as a way to make ends meet, she became a prostitute and would often give away her body because it was all she knew she could do. And she was living in all sorts of pain and shame. And then Jesus kind of invades her life, tells her that she is more than what she's grown up telling herself that she is. And she has this radical conversion into Christian faith. And at that point, as she was sharing her story, she's a single mom, and she brought her 2 kids who at the time were elementary age. And of course, just as she shares her story, it's just this captivating story of tremendous life change. And what was cool was I was standing up there as this 21-year-old kid who had just graduated from university, and I'm standing up here, and I just shared my story. And this And the pastor, Pete Scazzaro, he goes, isn't this great, guys? Like we're all part of the family of God. Isn't this great? Whatever background you come from, whatever you've grown up with, whether you grew up going to church or whether you were someone who didn't go to church or whether you were someone who comes from a poor background or whether you comes from like this upwardly mobile context, isn't it amazing? We're all welcome in the family. Because why? Because the Christian gospel is exclusively inclusive. All you and I need is nothing. All you and I need is need. To say, God, I need you, and I want to follow you. I want to give my life to you. And it's in those instances where God says, my love and my grace is free and full and lavish. How many of us today, we need to come before God and we need to come and express our need, our nothingness, and admit, I am a sinner. Hi, my name is Drew, and I need God's grace. John Donne, who's an English poet, he was someone that would actually also have a conversion to Christianity, but he struggled with his faith because he noticed that even after his faith, and he would begin to do his best to live the Christian life, and he would struggle and make mistakes and fall into sin again and again. And of course, he was this tremendous wordsmith, and he wrote this poem that I think describes so much of the experience of many Christians that I meet. And maybe if you're not a Christian here, it probably describes what might keep you from becoming a Christian, because he writes about his own struggle with his life and how he often, even in his mistakes, he would often lead other people into sinning and things like that. And so he writes this poem, and again, John Donne, who wrote in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, actually I think 16th, 17th century, and it's a hymn called A Hymn to God, Our Father. And I want to read it for you. And I think it describes many of the challenges that perhaps you and I go through when it comes to believing that this God is a God of grace and goodness. Here's what he writes. He says, "Wilt thou forgive that sin where I begun, which was my sin, though it were done before? Wilt thou forgive that sin through which I run and do run still, though still I do deplore? When thou hast done, thou hast not done, for I have more sin and struggle and shame. Wilt thou forgive that sin which I have won others to sin and made my sin their door? Wilt thou forgive that sin which I did shun a year or two, but wallowed in a score? When thou hast done, thou hast not done, for I have more." He writes, "I have a sin of fear that when I have spun my last thread, I shall perish on the shore. But swear by thyself that at my death, thy sun shall shine as he shines now and heretofore, and having done that, thou hast done. I fear no more."